In a quiet hall at the Tank Museum in England sits a squat little box of welded steel. It barely comes up to your chest. A grown man standing next to it can see clean over the roof. Tourists walk past it on their way to the famous monsters, the tiger, the king tiger, the giants that fill the documentaries, and the video games. But here is the thing almost nobody stops to ask. The tiger, that legend, was built 1,347 times. This little box was built roughly 2,800 times, more than twice as many. And in the last brutal year of the war, when German factories were collapsing under bombs, it was this cheap squat machine, not the Tiger, that kept killing Allied tanks right up to the final week. So which one actually won the war on the ground? The legend that cost a fortune and barely existed, or the box almost nobody remembers? This is the Jagdpanzer 38, the tank destroyer the Germans nicknamed the Hetzer, and its reputation as a death trap is real. But it is not the whole story, not even close. To understand why this thing existed at all, you have to go back to a country Germany had already swallowed. In 1939, before the shooting in the West even started, Germany seized Czechoslovakia. And the Czechs had something the Germans wanted very badly. A genuinely excellent light tank, built by the firm CKD in Prague and by the Skoda works. The Germans took it over and renamed it the Panzer 38T. That little t in brackets stood for the German word for Czech. That tank chassis is the seed of this whole story. By 1944, it was obsolete as a frontline tank. The gun was too small, the armor too thin. But the chassis underneath was reliable, it was cheap, and most importantly, Germany already owned the factories that built it. Those factories sat in occupied Czech cities, well to the east, away from the worst of the bombing that was flattening German plants in the Reich. So someone in the German army asked a simple question. What if we stop building the old tank, take that proven chassis, widen it, lengthen it, give it a stronger engine, and bolt a real anti-tank gun on top? Not a dream weapon. A weapon you could actually build by the thousand. That question became the Jagdpanzer 38. Production started in March of 1944. The first 3 vehicles rolled out of the BMM plant, the same Prague works that had been CKD before the Germans took it. 20 more followed in April. By July, the Skoda works joined in. The German plan was wildly ambitious. They wanted 1,000 of these things every single month. They never hit that number. But across roughly 14 months, from March 1944 to the 11th of May 1945, Czech factories turned out somewhere around 2,800 of them. The Tank Museum puts its own count at 2,612. Either way, the math is the same. This recycled Czech box outnumbered the mighty Tiger by about 2 to 1. But why build a low squat box at all? Why not just make more big tanks? To answer that, you have to look at the ugly machines that came before it. Before the Hetzer, the Germans tried to solve the same problem with vehicles like the Marder and the Nashorn. The idea was sound. Take a chassis, mount a powerful gun, send it to kill tanks. The problem was the crew compartment. These earlier machines were open on top. No roof. The gun crew stood in an open steel bathtub, exposed to the sky. That meant any shell fragment, any burst of machine gun fire from above, any tree burst from artillery rained straight down onto the men inside. They were tall, they were easy to see, and they offered almost no protection. They could kill a tank, but they died easily doing it. So the designers wanted 3 things at once. They wanted a roof over the crew, they wanted the whole machine low to the ground, so it was hard to spot, and they wanted it cheap enough to pour out of those Czech factories by the hundreds. The model for how to do that already existed, and it was called the Stug 3. The Stug was a German assault gun, a turretless box with the gun fixed in the hull. No turret meant it was cheaper, lower, and faster to build than a real tank. The Stug had already proven that a fixed gun in a low casemate could be one of the deadliest tank killers of the entire war. The Hetzer took that exact idea and shrank it down onto the cheap Czech chassis, and then they sloped everything. This is the clever part. The gun on the Hetzer was the 7, 5 cm, Paar, Car, 39 L48, that was no toy. It was a close cousin of the gun in the Stug 3, and it could punch through about 4.2 inches of steel, which is around 106 millimeters, at 500 yards. At a full 1,000 yards, it still bit through roughly 3.7 inches, about 95 millimeters. And if the crew loaded the rare tungsten core round, it could chew through about 4.7 inches, near 120 millimeters, at 500 yards. In plain terms, that gun could kill a Sherman. It could kill a T-34. From ambush, it could threaten almost anything the Allies could drive at it. Now the armor. The front plate was just over 2 1/3 inches of steel, 60 millimeters. On its own, that is not very thick. But the Czech designers laid that plate back at a steep 60 degrees from vertical. When a shell hits a plate at that kind of slant, it has to fight through far more metal than the plate is actually thick. The sloped front behaved like about 120 millimeters, close to 4.7 inches, of straight-up armor. The same protection as a plate, twice as thick, for half the weight. And the whole package was tiny. The Hetzer weighed about 17.5 US tons. A Tiger weighed around 60, so this thing was less than 1/3 the weight of the Legend. It stood about 7 feet tall at the very top of its machine gun mount, and only around 6 feet to the roof of the hull, no taller than a man, 20 feet long, 8.5 feet wide. Think about what that means on the ground. A machine you can hide behind a low stone wall, behind a hedgerow, in the corner of a wrecked farmyard, nose poking out just far enough to aim that gun. Everything that made it cheap also made it nearly invisible. And that was the whole point, because the Hetzer was never built to charge. It was built to wait. Picture how it was actually meant to fight. A Hetzer crew finds a good spot. A tree line at the edge of a field, maybe, with a road running across the open ground in front of them. They back the vehicle in until only the sloped front and the gun are showing. They pile branches and netting on top until the steel disappears into the hedge. Then the engine goes quiet and they wait. An Allied tank column rolls down that road, crews buttoned up, vision narrow, looking for movement. They see nothing, because there is nothing to see. The Hetzer is a bump in the brush. The gunner picks the lead tank. He picks it at maybe 500 yards, where his gun is deadly and the enemy is still oblivious. First shot. A tank brews up on the road. Before the rest of the column even works out where the fire came from, a second tank is hit. The Hetzers usually fought in pairs, 2 of them covering the same killing ground from slightly different angles, so the enemy got hit from 2 directions and guessed wrong about both. And then, before the Allies can range in their own guns or call artillery, the Hetzers reverse out of cover and slip away to do it all again from the next tree line. That was the doctrine. Shoot first, from cover, from concealment, against an enemy who never saw you. In that exact job, the cheap low silhouette was not a compromise, it was the weapon. One company of a unit called Panzerjägerabteilung 731 fighting on the Eastern Front knocked out 20 enemy tanks without losing a single vehicle of their own. That is what this machine could do when it was used the way it was designed. But here is where we have to be honest. Because the Hetzer earned its death trap nickname, and it earned it fairly. Start with that gun. To make the vehicle as narrow as possible, the designers shoved the gun over to the right side of the hull, off-center. And the mount barely moved. The gun could swing only 5 degrees to the left and 11 degrees to the right. That is almost nothing. For any target wider than a narrow cone straight ahead, the driver had to crank the entire vehicle around to point the nose at the enemy. In an ambush, where you already know which way the road runs, that is fine. You aim the whole machine before the shooting starts. But the moment a tank appears off to your side, or worse, behind you, you are in serious trouble. You cannot just spin a turret to meet it, because you do not have a turret. You have to turn the whole hull, slowly, while the enemy gun is already lined up on you. On soft or swampy ground, where turning was sluggish, this could be a death sentence. Now climb inside. And it gets worse. The crew of 4 were jammed down the left side of a cramped steel box. The driver up front on the left, the gunner behind him, the loader and radio man at the back, and the commander crammed into the right rear, tucked in behind the breech of the gun. That commander had a miserable view. Stuffed in a recess at the back right, with the gun and its mechanism filling the space in front of him, he struggled to see the battlefield. And when the hatches were shut, the whole vehicle was effectively blind to its right side. A button-down Hetzer simply could not see what was happening on its own right flank. In a machine that already could not turn its gun quickly, being blind on one side is exactly the kind of flaw that gets a crew killed by a tank they never noticed. The loader had his own nightmare. With the gun jammed over to the right, he was trying to wrestle heavy shells into a breach on the wrong side, reaching across his own body in a space with barely room to move. Loading was slow and awkward, and the cramped compartment had only 3 hatches for 4 men, which meant getting out fast, when the vehicle was burning, was a genuine problem. The driver in particular could struggle to escape in an emergency. Then there was the machine gun. The Hetzer carried a machine gun on the roof for fighting off infantry. On paper, smart. The gun was operated remotely from inside, so the crew could fire it without exposing themselves. But to reload it, somebody had to open a hatch and stand up into the open air, right in the middle of a fight, exactly where enemy infantry and snipers wanted him. The protection the roof gave you vanished the second the machine gun ran dry. And then there was the chassis itself, carrying more than it was ever designed to. The old Czech tank weighed around 9.5 tons. The Hetzer pushed about 17.5. They had piled armor and a gun onto a frame built for far less. The early vehicles were so nose-heavy that the front end visibly sagged, the whole machine unbalanced and hard on its front suspension. The designers fixed it during 1944, with changes to the suspension and the gun mantlet. But it tells you the truth about this vehicle. It was a chassis pushed right to the edge of what it could take. Side armor was only about 0.8 of an inch, 20 millimeters. Catch a Hetzer in the flank with almost any anti-tank weapon, and it died. Artillery could wreck it. In swampy ground, it could barely turn to face a threat. Every one of these complaints is true. So how do we square that? How is this both a death trap and the tank killer Germany could actually afford? Here is the reframe, and it is the whole point of this video. Every one of those flaws is the flaw of a cheap weapon, not a bad one, and those are completely different things. A cheap weapon makes hard trade-offs on purpose. It is small, so it is cramped and blind. It is light, so its sides are thin. Its gun barely traverses, so it can never win a swirling tank brawl on open ground. All true. But none of that was an accident, and none of it mattered if you used the machine the way it was meant to be used. Because the Hetzer was never supposed to fight a fair fight. It was supposed to sit hidden, shoot first, and leave before the enemy worked out what hit them. Judge it on the things it was built for, concealment and cost, and the first killing shot, and it is brilliant. Judge it on crew comfort, on visibility, on a flank fight it was specifically designed to avoid, and it is a death trap. Both descriptions are true. They are just describing different videos. The mistake is grading a cheap ambush weapon as if it were meant to be a Tiger, and once you grade it correctly, the numbers turn savage. Let me lay out the ledger. A Tiger I cost the German treasury about 250,800 Reichsmarks just for the bare tank. Get it combat ready, fueled, crewed, fully fitted, and the real figure climbed toward 400,000 Reichsmarks. For that money, you got one of the most fearsome machines of the war, and you got it 1,347 times total for the entire war. That is the legend. Now look at the cheaper end. A Stug 3, the conceptual parent, cost around 82,500 Reichsmarks. A Panther came in around 117,000. The Hetzer was deliberately designed to undercut even these, built fast and simple on a chassis Germany already owned. In factories, the bombers had trouble reaching. There is no clean, reliable price tag for a single Hetzer, so I will not invent one. But the design brief was the whole argument. Make it cheaper. Make it faster to build. Make it something you can afford to lose. And that last part is the key. Afford to lose. When a Tiger died, Germany lost a fortune and a machine it could barely replace. When a Hetzer died, the crew had usually already traded it for 1, 2, 3 Allied tanks from ambush, and the Czech factories simply built another one. You do not need your tank killer to survive. You need it to kill more than it costs. On that one brutal measure, cost against kills, the squat little box crushed the legend. That is why these vehicles were still rolling out of the factories in the final days. Production did not stop until the 11th of May 1945, days after the war in Europe was effectively over. The Tiger lines had long gone silent under the bombs. The cheap Czech tank destroyer was the weapon Germany could still build when it could build almost nothing else, and crews were still killing Allied armor with it in the last week of the fighting. For the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the famous Battle of the Bulge, the Germans massed 295 Hetzers in 21 separate anti-tank companies, not a handful of museum curiosities. A real, mass-produced backbone of the late-war anti-tank force. And there is one final piece of proof that the design was fundamentally sound, not fundamentally broken. It comes from a neutral country with no reason to flatter German engineering. After the war, neutral Switzerland went shopping for a tank destroyer. They did not want anything exotic. They wanted something cheap, reliable, and good in the defense, sitting in the Alps waiting for an invader who might come from any direction. So Czechoslovakia kept the production line running and built them a post-war version called the G13. The Swiss ordered 158 of them, starting around 1946. And the Swiss kept these machines in service until 1970. Think about that. A quarter of a century after the war ended, this little box was still soldiering on in a peacetime army that could have bought anything it wanted. They tinkered with it, swapping the commander and loader positions and later refitting many of them with Swiss Saurer diesel engines in the early 1950s. But the bones of the vehicle, the cheap, low Czech tank destroyer, were good enough that a careful neutral nation trusted them for decades. You do not keep a genuine death trap for 25 years of peace. You keep a sound, cheap, reliable machine. So let us go back to that quiet museum hall and the squat little box the tourists walk past on their way to the giants. The Tiger deserves its legend. It was a terrifying machine, and the men who faced it were right to fear it. But the Tiger was also a machine Germany could barely build and could not afford to lose, and there were never enough of them to matter in the way the documentaries pretend. The Hetzer is the opposite story. Cramped, blind on one side, thin on the flanks, a real death trap if you used it wrong. But cheap, low, easy to hide, built by the thousand on a chassis Germany already owned, and lethal, from ambush right up to the final week of the war. One of them killed Allied tanks, the other one mostly killed in our memory. The Tiger won the documentaries. The Hetzer won the arithmetic.